Stop. Before you scroll past this, what if everything you were taught about who invented writing was missing an entire continent? Not adjusted, not debated, missing. Let that sit for a second. Because right now, in classrooms around the world, children are learning that writing began somewhere in Mesopotamia, and maybe, if the textbook is generous, China gets a mention. Africa? Barely a footnote. But here is what the archaeological record actually says, and what it has been saying for decades. The Nile Valley was producing written language while other civilizations were still figuring out how to organize their harvests. This is not a conspiracy. This is not revisionism. This is what happens when you follow the evidence without the politics attached to it. Let us go back, way back. Around 3200 BCE, the earliest known Egyptian hieroglyphics begin appearing, not as scattered symbols on cave walls, but as a fully functioning system of communication. Tags, labels, inscriptions on ivory, on pottery, on the walls of tombs. Historians have found evidence of this at sites like Abydos in Upper Egypt, where a tomb believed to belong to a pre-dynastic ruler called Scorpion I yielded over 200 inscribed bone and ivory tags. These were not decorations, these were administrative records. These were the receipts of an economy already complex enough to need them. And Abydos is not the only site telling the story. Across the ancient sites of Hierakonpolis, Nikkata, and the broader Nile corridor, artifacts carrying proto-hieroglyphic markings have been pulled from the earth, markings that predate what we were told was the birth of organized writing in East Asia by several centuries. Now, let's talk about China, because that comparison is not casual. For a long time, the narrative around early Chinese writing was treated as almost mythologically ancient. The oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, discovered at Anyang, were held up as one of humanity's oldest writing systems. And they are remarkable. Do not misread what is being said here. The oracle bones, dating to around 1200 BCE, represent one of the most significant archaeological finds in history. But the Shang dynasty inscriptions come nearly 2,000 years after the Egyptian writing systems had already been established, cataloged, and used to run an empire. 2,000 years. That is not a minor discrepancy. That is not a rounding error. That is the kind of gap that should fundamentally change how we teach the history of human communication. And yet, it rarely does. Now, some academics will point to the Yangshao culture and early markings found on pottery in China dating to around 5000 BCE, arguing that these symbols represent the seeds of a writing tradition that would eventually become the Chinese script. That argument has some archaeological support, but here is where precision matters. Marks on pottery and a functional script that records administrative, religious, and political information are two very different things. The Egyptians were not just scratching signs, they were documenting tax records, royal decrees, religious rituals, and commercial exchanges. The leap from symbol to system is enormous, and Egypt made that leap first. And Egypt is Africa. That sentence should not need repeating, but given how persistently some academic traditions have attempted to culturally separate ancient Egypt from the continent it sits on, it does. John Henrik Clarke, the scholar and historian who spent decades challenging the sanitized versions of African history, put it plainly when he argued that African people were the first to organize their spiritual, intellectual, and administrative lives into written systems. The work of scholars like Ivan van Sertima, Cheikh Anta Diop, and later Molefi Asante pushed the same point from different angles, that the continent was not a passive recipient of civilizational ideas from elsewhere. It was a source, a deep, original source. And the physical evidence backs this up. In 1998, German archaeologist Günther Dreyer and his team excavating at Abydos announced findings that shook the archaeological world. The inscribed tablets and tags from Tomb UJ, believed to belong to a ruler from around 3200 BCE, showed a writing system already sophisticated enough to record quantities, locations, and ownership. Dreyer argued these were some of the earliest examples of true writing ever discovered. Not proto-writing, not symbolic decoration, writing. His conclusions were debated, as all such findings are, but the debate itself is instructive. When Western archaeologists found early inscriptions in Mesopotamia or markers in the Indus Valley, those findings were celebrated and widely incorporated into historical timelines. When African material of equal or greater age surfaces, the question of whether it counts as real writing somehow becomes the central issue. That asymmetry in how evidence is treated is not accidental. It reflects something deeper about who gets to be seen as the originator of civilization and who gets filed under the category of influenced by. But let us stay with the facts, because the facts are powerful enough on their own. The Narmer palette, dating to approximately 3100 BCE, is one of the earliest examples of historical narrative in human record. It commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler, and it does so through a visual written language already refined enough to tell a political story with symbolic precision. You are looking at propaganda, ancient Egyptian propaganda, which means you are looking at a society that had already moved past survival and into the realm of governance, ideology, and information management. That requires writing. Writing that was already developed enough to serve those functions at that point in time. For comparison, the earliest confirmed Chinese writing, oracle bone inscriptions from Anyang, appear around 1200 BCE during the reign of the Shang dynasty. These inscriptions were used primarily for divination, questions posed to ancestors or deities, with answers interpreted through cracks formed in heated bones. They are extraordinary. They also come approximately 2,000 years after Egypt had already been running a literate bureaucratic state. The most conservative mainstream timelines for early Egyptian writing still place it at roughly 3200 BCE. The most conservative estimates for early Chinese script place the oracle bone inscriptions at 1200 BCE. The gap exists. It is documented, it is peer-reviewed, and it still somehow fails to disrupt the dominant global narrative about where writing began. Part of the reason this story struggles to reach mainstream audiences is that African history, particularly the history of sub-Saharan Africa and the Nile Valley, was systematically de-emphasized during the colonial period. The institutions that controlled academic publishing, museum curation, and historical education had strong ideological reasons to minimize the role of African people as innovators and originators. That is not a fringe claim. It is something that historians of science, history of education, and post-colonial scholars have documented in painstaking detail. Martin Bernal's work in Black Athena, while controversial in its scope and some of its specific arguments, raised a crucial point, that 18th and 19th century European scholarship deliberately revised the earlier understanding of Greek civilization's debts to Egypt and Africa. What had previously been acknowledged, that Greek philosophy, science, and culture drew heavily from the Nile Valley, was systematically erased from academic tradition as European racial ideology hardened. The result was a version of world history where Africa contributed almost nothing to the intellectual foundations of civilization, and where Egypt was frequently removed from Africa through the convenient fiction of treating African and Egyptian as separate categories. But the Nile does not flow out of the Mediterranean. It flows north toward it, from deep within the African continent, and the civilization that rose along its banks was African in geography, in population, and in origin. Egyptologist Fakhri Hassan argued that the emergence of writing in Egypt was tied directly to the administrative demands of a growing state, the need to manage grain, labor, tribute, and ritual obligation across a large territory. Writing, in that view, was not a luxury. It was a technology that the Egyptian state invented because it needed it. That kind of need-driven innovation is exactly how civilizations mark the boundary between simple social organization and complex governance. Egypt crossed that boundary before any other human civilization left a comparable written record. And this is where the emotional weight of the topic really begins to land. Because if Egypt developed writing before China, and the archaeological evidence suggests it did by a margin of nearly 2,000 years, then Africa did not receive the gift of literacy from somewhere else. Africa gave it. The flow of cultural and intellectual exchange that shaped the ancient world ran in significant part from the Nile outward. Greek scholars knew this. Herodotus wrote about it. Diodorus of Sicily wrote about it. The ancient Greeks, whatever their other biases, had enough proximity and intellectual honesty to acknowledge that Egypt was where serious knowledge came from. It was Roman and later European scholarship that began piece by piece to sever that connection. That severing had consequences that extend to the present day. When children in Africa are taught that their ancestors had no written language until colonizers arrived, they are being taught a lie built from the deliberate suppression and misreading of their own history. When African history is presented as a story that begins with external contact, whether from Arabs, Europeans, or Asians, the inversion of the actual record is nearly total. The record says something else entirely. The record says that along the Nile, somewhere around 3200 BCE, a civilization developed the technology of writing. It used that technology to manage a state, preserve religious knowledge, record history, and communicate across distance and time. It refined that technology over centuries until it produced one of the most visually complex and intellectually rich written traditions the world has ever seen. And it did all of this while China was still centuries away from producing its first oracle bone. None of this diminishes what China achieved. The oracle bone inscriptions are extraordinary. The development of Chinese script into the system still used today is one of the great stories in the history of human culture. Chinese civilization has contributed enormously to humanity, and that contribution stands on its own without any comparison. But the comparison matters here, not to diminish, but to correct. Because the narrative that has been used to diminish Africa is built in part on a false chronology. And when you correct the chronology, the picture that emerges is not one where Africa lags behind, it is one where Africa led. The Egyptians were writing before China. That is not poetry, that is archaeology. That is stratigraphy, carbon dating, material analysis, and decades of work by researchers across the world, African, European, and Asian alike, who have gone into the ground and found the evidence that speaks. The question is no longer whether this is true. The question is why so many people still do not know that it is. And the answer to that question is a chapter of history that is just as important as the chapter about the writing itself, because the forces that buried this knowledge were just as organized, just as deliberate, and just as sophisticated as the civilization that produced it. Africa wrote first. Now the world needs to read that sentence and sit with what it means.